Hello everyone, and welcome once again to Caleb Likes Books. Today I have another book for review for you, and that is for Rhythm of War, which is the fourth book in the Stormlight archive by Brandon Sanderson. This is a book that I had been really looking forward to reading. For those of you who don't know, and probably some of you do, I have loved the Stormlight archive so far. All of the first three books are among my favorites I have ever read, and so obviously I was very excited to read Rhythm of War. Um, and it definitely, I expected to love it, of course, and it lived up to my expectations for sure. It is maybe my least favorite of the series so far, but in a series that is so consistently awesome, it being slightly lesser for me is not a big deal because it was still really awesome. So let's get into it. I may discuss spoilers later. I haven't actually decided yet. I will probably decide that later in this review. But I do have a lot of non-spoiler things that I want to discuss about this book. First of all, I really enjoyed the character work here. As usual for these books, a specific character gets a focus in each book. In the first book, it was Kaladin. Second book, it was Shallan. Third book, it was Dalinar. In this book, I would say that it seems like the focus character is supposed to be Venli, who is one of the Parshendi characters or listener characters, or they go by a bunch of different names, whichever you prefer to call them. Which is a different race from the humans. And she gets a lot of attention in this book. She is the one who gets flashbacks focused on her alongside, I believe, her sister, Eshonai. So she is very clearly the focus of this book. However, I would argue there are two focus characters in this book, the other being Navani. Navani was also great in this book. I really enjoyed both of these characters. I would say I enjoyed Navani more, but they were both really good. Navani's side of the story focused a lot more on the science of this series, working with these things called fabrials, which I don't entirely understand exactly what they are, to be honest. Working very heavily within the science and using the magic as science, and things like that, which was really interesting. Definitely went over my head at a lot of points, but it was very interesting nonetheless. And then Venli's side of the story was really cool as well. It was probably my least favorite part of the book, which, just to get this negative out of the way, because this is the one negative I have about this book, and I feel like it's appropriate to talk about it here since I'm talking about Venli. Venli kind of wasn't as interesting to me as the rest of the book was, especially in the flashbacks, but really in general. But I did still enjoy her character a lot. It was interesting seeing this different culture and learning about it and seeing how it is woven into the world, especially, was super interesting. Personally, I just didn't find that side of the story as engaging as other ones, and it is the one single downside to this book, in my opinion. Everything else was awesome. And this was still pretty awesome, just not as awesome. So there's that. Other characters were also great. Kaladin in this book was amazing. I felt like Kaladin, I don't really want to say he was a letdown in Oathbringer, because I don't think he was, but his character in Oathbringer, I think, was not as great as it was in the first two books. I think Oathbringer was his weakest book, which was kind of sad for me because he's my favorite character in this series, most likely. But this book brings him right back up. He is a great character in this book. I loved his arc in this book. What's going on with him basically is, in these first few books, he is very much involved in being a part of the army of the Alethi, I think. He is, very into that, very much like working with Dalinar and the other very highly placed people, noblemen, that kind of thing. But in this book, he kind of ends up having to take a back seat and not work so much in terms of military and kind of focus more on his original calling, which was being a surgeon, and being, more in the medical field, doing some really, really cool stuff with that, which I won't get too much into because I think it's kind of a spoiler, but he gets much more involved in things like mental health, which I loved. I didn't dive into it as much as I might have liked, You know, it kind of started getting really into that, and then it kind of cut off and didn't really go too much deeper into it. I wish there had been more of that. But what is there was awesome. And this is definitely, I think, a better part for Kaladin than an Oathbringer. Perhaps better than Words of Radiance as well, but it's hard. I'd put them about the same level. The first two books in this one. For Kaladin, he was great in this book. Dalinar is good in this book. He is a much smaller presence than he has been in previous books. He, from my memory, he doesn't appear that much in this book, but he was good in this book. Adolin and Shallan go off into Shadesmar and have some interesting escapades there. Really enjoyed Shallan in this book, especially seeing her and her multiple personas of Shallan, Veil, and Radiant is really interesting, and seeing the way these three personas interact and the way that she handles different situations using these different personas. That was all really cool. Lots of cool mysteries that she is going into in this book. Adolin's great in this book as well. Really enjoyed him. And yeah, all the different characters. There's more that I'm forgetting, I'm sure. Moash appears in this book. I know the Sanderson fandom likes to hate on Moash because he's not a great guy by the point of this book. And he does some things in this book that are not very good. But he is one of my favorite characters in the series. I find him such a fascinating character, even though I kind of hate his guts sometimes. He's one of those characters that like is very easy to hate because he does horrible things, but he is such an interesting character to me. Very much like the inverse in many ways of Kaladin, and the way that his journey and Kaladin's intersect and reflect one another in completely different ways is super cool. And I really enjoyed him in this book. I thought he was really cool. And then, you know, all the other characters, like I mentioned, everyone else was great in this book as well. Teft, loved him in this book. Szeth, who I don't believe appeared a huge amount in this book, but he was good whenever he did appear. Lift appears a bit more prominently in this book. She was good. You know, lots of great characters in this book, basically. Lots of Bridge 4 as well. They were all good. Moving on a bit, the plot of this book was really interesting. Lots of moving pieces, as there are in all of these books, but all of the different moving pieces were interesting in some way. And I'm not going to get too much into this because it does take place a ways into the book, probably I'd say 2/3, or not 2/3, maybe like 2/5 or halfway through the book. So I'm not going to get too heavily into it. But there is a big event that happens in this book. The Parshendi are preparing to do this big thing in the beginning of this book, and they execute their plan, you know, some ways into the book. And seeing that part of it was amazing, and really changed a lot of things for this book, really raised the stakes a lot, and allowed for a lot of interesting things to be revealed about the world, about the lore. Lots of great character stuff because of it. You know, all kinds of things, which I'll probably talk about if I get into spoilers. But yeah, that stuff was great as well. I loved the world building in this book. Of course, by now we know quite a bit about this world, but there's plenty more to learn, and there's a lot of really cool stuff going on in this book in regards to that. One last thing that I do want to address, non-spoiler for this book. The structure of this book's a bit weird. This is sort of a negative, but not massively, I would say. But the big one for me was Venli just wasn't as engaging as I would have liked. But the other thing for me is the structure of this book's a little weird, especially in regards to the flashbacks. The flashbacks of this book has 5 parts. The flashbacks don't come in until part 3, I think. It was either part 3 or part 4. I believe it's part 3. In the other Stormlight books, the flashbacks are throughout the entire book, from beginning pretty much to end. They are just all throughout the book, but they are heavily focused in the second half of this book. In fact, the only other flashback in the first half of this book is the prologue, and is from a completely different character's perspective. So the flashbacks in this book were really weird to me because the first half of this book felt really well paced, and I was super into it. And then once we hit the back half of the book, you get a lot of flashbacks, which were pretty interesting, but they definitely messed a little bit with the pacing, in my opinion. And, you know, I would be getting really into it, and then it'd be like, here's a flashback sequence that you don't care about quite as much. And I'd be like, oh, okay. And then I'd read that, and then I'd get back to the awesome stuff, and then it would happen over again. And granted, this would still be a problem if the flashbacks were throughout the entire book, but it felt very heavily loaded towards the back, and it was just really weird. I don't know what the reason it was for Sanderson doing this. I assume it must, you know, just fit better there, or something. I know that he has said in the past that he doesn't think he did the best on those flashbacks, and I would agree with that. But yeah, just the structure of the book's a little bit weird. That's really the only other complaint I have about it, though. So now we're going to get into spoilers. So if you have not read this book before, I would highly recommend skipping this part of the video. I will have timestamps in the description so you can skip to the end and see my final thoughts on this book. But there are some things that are spoilery that I do want to talk about with this book, because there's some crazy stuff that happens in this book. So last chance, I'm going to get into spoilers now. Okay. So first thing I'm going to talk about is the big thing that I mentioned that happens. The Parshendi completely take over Urithiru, however the heck you say that place's name. The big tower of the Knights Radiant. And that was crazy. The big scene of them doing that was amazing. It was such an interesting twist on the plot of the book, allowed for some really cool stuff. And then seeing, you know, all the characters who are at Urithiru trying to deal with, you know, being there, you know, Kaladin, who is, if he is seen by the Parshendi, is going to be actively hunted down, basically, you know, trying to hide and figure things out, figure out how to get out of the situation, being the one single Radiant left who is still conscious. Or granted, there's a couple of other ones that are still around, but he is basically alone in this situation. All the stuff with the sibling was really cool, and him contacting Navani, lots of cool stuff there. Getting more of a look at the Parshendi culture was really cool through that and through Venli. Yeah, the whole taking over Urithiru and dealing with that was really cool, and I really enjoyed it. It was a great twist on the story. The rest of my things that I want to talk about more so take place towards the end of the book, of course. First, before I forget about it, because I feel like I might, I want to talk about Adolin and Shallan in Shadesmar. I loved the stuff with Adolin going on trial to basically, you know, fight to basically say that people on Roshar, you know, the Spren should be willing to help them against Odium, I think is basically what his angle is. And seeing that was really cool, getting that kind of, you know, him trying to get through to the Spren, but then kind of getting pushback and all that kind of stuff was really cool. Shallan's stuff was really interesting, trying to figure out, you know, who was the spy and all this stuff, and then finding out it was Pattern the whole time. That was really cool. Pattern in this book also is wonderful, of course. And just everything with Shallan, towards the end of this book, with her dealing with this fourth personality called the Formless, that comes up to the surface towards the end of the book, I got chills when the Formless came up, and seeing what she was getting ready to do, and then finding out, you know, all the stuff about her, how she was using that side of her personality to deal with things was amazing. And all that stuff, and you know, everything with Shallan I thought was great. I've seen the fandom kind of throw some hate towards Shallan, say that she's not that interesting, but I love Shallan. I think she's awesome. Kaladin basically inventing therapy in this book was really cool. Again, I wish I had seen some more of that, but it was really cool, and I really connected a lot with a lot of Kaladin's story in this book. Kaladin is one of those characters that, from the moment he appeared in the first book, I've always really connected with, and I really enjoyed a lot of the stuff with him in this book. I felt like it really resonated with me. Seeing the way that he is dealing with like his depression and things like that, I think that gets a big focus in this book. and it really hit me in a lot of places, and seeing how the events of everything going on around him affect him. And it was very inspiring to me by the end, and seeing how he kind of overcame all of that. And but knowing that it's still there and it's still something that he's going to have to continue to work through. And I think that's also an important thing to include, because these kinds of issues are not things that just go away. And yeah, I loved his side of the story as well. More stuff with the end of the book. Navani bonding the sibling and becoming a Radiant, that was super awesome. The whole, again, the whole end of this book was amazing. I have to talk about the thing with Moash, the one of the big things that happens in this book. Moash kills Teft. Now, this is something that I actually knew going in. This is one of the very few spoilers for this series that I managed to not avoid. I did not know when it was coming, although by the time I finished Oathbringer, I knew it was in Rhythm of War. I knew that Moash was the one who would kill Teft, but I did not know the circumstances, did not know when or how it would happen. But it still hit me super hard when it happened, even knowing that it was coming. Teft was one of my favorite characters, especially after Oathbringer. Oathbringer, he really resonated with me a lot. And Moash also being one of my favorite characters. Seeing that happen was really emotional for me, really hit me hard. But the way that he died, I can't remember it verbatim, but the last line of that chapter, one of the last lines of that chapter, saying like, despite that, he was still full of hope. Like, that hit me really hard. And it was an amazing scene, and seeing Kaladin's reaction to that was heart-wrenching and just incredibly written. Cannot praise it enough. And I also have to give a quick shout out to Hoid, who tells the story of the Dog and the Dragon. All of the stories that Hoid tells within these books is amazing. And of course, the Dog and the Dragon. I've already seen, prior to reading this book, how much it resonated with people, so I was very excited to read it myself, and I really enjoyed it. And the kind of moral of that story was very impactful to me as well. And Hoid was great in this book, of course, or Wit, as he is frequently called in the Stormlight archive. He was great, as always. Yeah, one other thing that I just thought of that I need to talk about is Zael, however the heck you say his name, who is Vasher from Warbreaker. The way that this is hinted at, this is something that I already knew. I got the hints of it in Oathbringer, kind of put the dots together, and then looked it up and found out, oh, he is actually Vasher. Obviously, I already kind of got the hints in Oathbringer too, but seeing the even more obvious hints that he drops in this book towards the beginning of, hey, yeah, this is stuff about me, and I thought that was really cool. Just wanted to point that out as well. So that pretty much wraps up my thoughts on this book. So no more spoilers from here on out. These are just my final thoughts on the book. So overall, I loved this book a lot, obviously. It's a Stormlight book. I'm probably going to love it. It's a Sanderson book. I'm probably going to love it. But yeah, it is maybe my least favorite of the series so far, but it is still amazing. You know, this series in general just really does something for me. Like, I don't know what it is about it, because it's such a big series, it's so ambitious, it's so full of stuff, and it feels like it should be so daunting and hard to keep track of, and all these things, and it is daunting and it is hard to keep track of at times, but it's one of the most engaging and I would say even comforting books this series is for me. And it feels weird to say that about giant books that are 1,200 pages long, where it's like, oh yes, I'm gonna sit down for a nice, light, fun read. But that's what this series is to me. It's just so much fun, and I love it so much. So even saying this is my least favorite book in the series, maybe my second to least favorite, it's hard to say. It's definitely in the bottom two, fighting it out with Words of Radiance, unpopular opinion. But it's still amazing, like, even then. Cannot recommend it enough, cannot recommend this series enough. I cannot wait to read the next book, Winds and Truth, that is coming out next year, which actually, as of my time recording this was announced yesterday, the release date and the official title for that book, which is super exciting. Cannot wait to get my hands on it and see how this arc of the Stormlight Archive ends. It's going to be super awesome, I bet, and I cannot wait. So, as far as my rating out of 10 that I would give this book, I would give it a 9.5 out of 10. Very close to the same rating I give the other books, which I think all of the first three I gave 10 out of 10. Again, Venli and the structure of this book brings this one down slightly for me, but not really all that much. Like, this is still a freaking incredible book. So, yeah. Definitely highly recommend it, and I really loved it. So that is pretty much it for this video. Let me know in the comments what you thought of Rhythm of War if you have read it. If you have not read it before, let me know if you're interested in reading it, if you're interested in this series, or if you are maybe reading this series but haven't reached Rhythm of War, let me know what you're thinking of it so far, and all that kind of stuff. Let me know all that in the comments. So that is pretty much it for this video. So thank you all for watching, and I will see you guys next time.